So my session today, as you can tell on the screen, effective threat detection, right? There's a lot of things to do in cybersecurity. I decided to focus specifically this session on how to detect more effectively, right? There's a lot to do in cybersecurity, but one of the biggest challenges that we've seen is actually being able to know that we're under attack or potentially already compromised and to act quickly, right? We hear about breaches that go 200, 300 days without ever being discovered. Like we heard, my name is Steve Caimi. I've been doing cybersecurity in various forms for about 20 years now. I started with my career at Citicorp, putting up some of the initial firewalls and network segmentation and things like that, and I've had a chance to evolve through. Before I get started, though, I know this picture might be a little hard to see, and obviously all the slides, will be available. But I don't know if you can see this picture. There's a little gate there, right? And it's a picture, so you can clearly see, the people are driving around the gate, right? It's a pretty classic picture, and the way I think of it is, in the cybersecurity world, right? It's so hard to see sometimes, all the different angles and the different vectors by which threats can actually materialize. And in the real world, sometimes it's a little easier, right, than in the cybersecurity world. I'll start with just a couple of the threat detection scenarios. Certainly there are millions of them, and probably a lot of them will be covered, throughout the session today, but the various sessions throughout the week, But I'll show just a couple of threat detection scenarios and just ask yourself, and feel free, obviously, like in the previous session, to interact. One of the first things I wanted to point out is in a detection scenario, here's where we have a simplified version of a network and a firewall and internet connection and things. And let's say we have a normal set of traffic patterns, right? We have a database server. It has sensitive information stored on it, right? We have all different types of devices connecting to the network, whether hardwired in or wirelessly, right? But one day, all of a sudden, that database server starts sending a whole pile of information out through the internet connection, right? How many of our organizations would be able to spot it? What if it's all standard port 80 traffic or SSL type traffic that looks normal to the firewall and it's allowed out? Right? How many in our organizations could spot that anomalous traffic pattern quickly, right, and discover that potentially is a massive data breach? Another scenario that comes to mind that you hear a lot of is malicious code. Right? There's a lot of different vectors by which we can be affected by malware. Right? We can just simply click on the link. Right? We hear all kinds of stories about people who receive the email. It looks legitimate, right? And maybe it's a spear phishing attack that's targeted. You click on the link, and all of a sudden you download malware, or maybe it's part of an attachment. End users, all of us, are very tempted to trust, right, and to open up the attachments. And sometimes it's very easy to be the one that just downloads that malware. Now, if the malware is sitting there and it looks legitimate, right, maybe it's a half of a file that looks fine, right, it's not being detected by anything. It's sitting there lying dormant. It's waiting for another piece of code potentially to come down before it activates. How many of us would have the ability to spot the fact that it's there? Or the fact that once it's in the network, right, what if it starts acting up and combines and morphs, right, with different technologies to be able to identify that malware is indeed acting up? Another scenario I would point out is all the cloud applications that are out there. Increasingly, a lot of us are using cloud applications, and we at Cisco, we do too, right? We have a number of sanctioned applications through Box and Salesforce and things like that. But how many of us in the organization have sensitive information that probably shouldn't be placed in those types of systems, right, with consumer-grade types of controls? We even see it in the healthcare industry where protected health information is going from healthcare providers' phones up to cloud applications, which obviously cannot be a major source of not only violations, like for HIPAA violations and Office of Civil Rights and things, but what about just releasing student information, personal information and things like that? So how will you know, right, once the data is up there in cloud applications? And I guess the last one doesn't really require detection, right? We hear a lot about ransomware, right? So the FBI puts out here that they say basically malware is data that encrypts or locks all of our files, right? Imagine, we just saw how in that crypto challenge previously, imagine sitting there and trying to decide, we don't have good backups. We either have to try to crack the code here or pay the ransom, to get our data back. But I jokingly point that out because with ransomware, you'll know, right? You'll know immediately because the people want payment, right? They'll ask for payment in Bitcoins or something anonymously. But at that point, it's too late, right? We have to put the right controls in place. And, I contrast that with some of the other scenarios. So let's move forward. Let's talk a little about, like I said, effective threat detection and why the detection function is really so important. Some of the material that I'm providing is from Cisco's security reports. I wanted to point that out because it's research that our group called Talos, they're our threat research organization. They put together, right, they analyze data from a number of our customers. We actually survey, customers like you to find out what some of your challenges are. And every year in January and June, we publish and make available on Cisco.com, our security report. So if you haven't had a chance to check some of those out, some of the content, I'm bringing you here today, is from some of those reports. And then another fantastic place to get information about data breaches and what to do about it, if you're not already familiar, is what's called the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. I think they've been publishing those reports since about 2008 or so. And Verizon, as a major managed service provider, they have a lot of insight into the various types of breaches that occur, right? What is actually effective, what's been working in terms of the controls that help data breaches. So along those lines, and one of the things I like about the Verizon report is they jokingly put out in the all throughout the report things like rock and roll type of analogies. And they said in this one, this is from the report, they said Mick Jagger was wrong, right? Time is not on our side when it comes to detection. I know it might be hard to see these two charts. This comes out of the Verizon Data Breach Report 2016. But what you're actually seeing on the top chart is in a matter of minutes, over 80% between the time that an attack occurs to the time that the actual systems are compromised. And over 80% of those cases, that happens in just minutes. Think about that for a second. Right? You think about how quickly we need to be able to act today, right? And how hard it is to do, right? We've already talked about the difficulty, with the looking at cybersecurity. It's not as simple as watching people drive around the gate and saying, hey, there's an open hole there. The chart at the bottom is what they're talking about is in terms of times to exfiltrate or take the data out. So not just to compromise the system, but actually to surgically, in a lot of cases, remove data. And a lot of hacks are actually looking just specifically for the data they're looking for and take only that data, so that it doesn't highlight or trip alerts. So for example, picture trying to attack a credit card database and only taking the most relevant information, maybe the card numbers, the codes in the back and the names, and leaving all the rest of the data there. Right? That way that doesn't trip alarms in terms of, and what we're saying here in this chart is that happens in just a matter of days. It's just not acceptable today to go 200 days without, between the time that you've been affected and discovering the fact that you've been breached, right? In many, many ways, the barn door has already opened, right? So I think that really emphasizes some of the key points about how we have to do a better job. And I'm hoping to share with you, some insight into how we can better effectively detect cyber threats. I think all of us know about the cyber threat landscape. I think it's probably a key message all throughout. It's probably the reason why you're sitting in this room. From our Talos research organization, what we continue to see, and I think you probably already know, is that attacks and attackers just continue to be effective. They always seem to be one step ahead of the defenses, right? So we have to find and change our mindset in how we use people, process, and technology to come together to do a much better job of not only defending, right, but also discovering those threats. Secondly, the one challenge I think that a lot of organizations have, and I've certainly seen, over the years and actually been part of, I have to say, is some of the challenges associated with interconnecting our people, process, and technology, right? Think about in your own organization, how many different types of cybersecurity technologies are there. Think about how few people we are. Think about all the different processes that are necessary to take and respond to cyber threats, right? And the role that every person and technology plays, the fact that we have different vendors and they're not necessarily integrated. That's what we're saying in terms of a fragmented response that's really prevalent in industry today, from the largest government agency to higher education to organizations organizations all around the globe. So that fragmented response is really a big thing that's affecting our ability to respond effectively. And I think one of the things that is probably just intuitive is that we probably just need a better job of visibility, right? The first thing we need to understand is what are the threats and what are the different vectors. So we need to be able to see, right? Like I mentioned in that picture before, right? Their cyber threats aren't necessarily so easy to see. But not only do we need that visibility, but we need better types of controls, modern types of controls. A firewall today alone obviously won't stop these types of threats. And we have to include threat intelligence, right? Leverage the intelligence that's out there and add context around our threats, right? To understand and be able to respond. We can't respond to millions and millions and millions of alerts, right? There's a lot of technologies that are out there that try to whittle that down, but they all have to, be able to work together. So that's typically where I say, just think about in your own organization, if you were to be compromised today, what would you have done differently in the past? Well, I think one of the things I'd like to put out there is, some of the key tenets of a integrated threat defense strategy that I think we can all benefit from. And if we take this type of approach, I think we'll all do a better job of responding effectively. One of the things that I've been a big proponent on, remember how in the previous session when we're looking at those coins and trying to solve those challenges, it's, those guys were saying, sometimes you wonder, well, where do we start? And in a lot of ways, cybersecurity can be like that, right? Where do you start? There's all kinds of things out there, and there's different technologies and services. We have legacy firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, but now we have this malware threat. We have ransomware. We have all kinds of things to consider. I put this out here, and I have spoken many, many times over the past 2 years about the NIST cybersecurity framework. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they put out a number of computer security guidelines over the years. And many of you might already be familiar with the 800 series publications that get into various aspects of computer security and incident response, mobile and cloud computing. Right? There's no shortage, I don't think, of best practices that are out there. But when the cybersecurity framework came out, I think one of the things that was most powerful about it was that it put cybersecurity concepts, I think, first into what's called these core functions. Right? You can see them across the screen: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Right? If you think about it, what they're basically saying is that from the identify function, we can't protect what we don't know what we have. We have to have the right controls in place to know what kind of hardware is on our networks. We have to know what software. We have to know what software is vulnerable. We have to understand our configuration management. We have to understand our network flows. We have to understand what kind of external systems we're connecting with. Right? All of that feeds into things like the identify function, which gets us thinking about what we need to do, right, in order to protect, effectively. For the past 20 years, I think a lot of our mindset has been, hey, let's protect, right? Let's put up all the defenses and try to build a wall, right? And I think a lot of us realize that, we have to do a better job of protecting. But if you can see how these things work together, right? All 5 of these functions are concurrent, right? They need to be working together. It's not a one-step flow. But to protect is all those typical types of controls that we put in place, not only from, process and so forth and planning out and having the right protective types of controls, right? The types of things that are the most effective, today. Obviously, the highlight of the presentation today is on the detect function, and I'll highlight and zoom into that in just a second. But it's once we've detected, I think we've already seen that we have to be able to do a better job of responding quickly, right? We can't just detect something and then take a long time, right, from a miscoordinated response or not understanding the situation. Maybe we detect some kind of anomaly, but we don't know what to do about it, right? So the right types of controls to be able to respond effectively, right? So that the people, process, and technology all link and respond immediately. And then finally, recover is that function that gets into not only restoring operations, right, and getting back to normal, but it also gets into things like lessons learned. How do we put what we've just learned from that incident back into our processes so that we can learn and grow and improve? If you're not already familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, nist.gov/cyber framework is the URL. I'm happy to share with you more about it. But it's fantastic. I think every cybersecurity professional should at least be aware of the framework, right, and take a look at it. It's not only a set of best practices, but also drives a very simple risk management process to help you figure out where the investments need to happen, right? In other words, trying to break that problem down into pieces, right, so that we can tackle it a piece at a time and not be overwhelmed by the coin, right, staring at it and going, where do we start, right? So again, that's I could speak for a whole hour or more on the cybersecurity framework itself, but obviously, the focus today is on the detect function. So when NIST puts it out there, they basically say, look, these are the capabilities that are necessary not only to put the right activities in place, to not only identify that occurrence of a cybersecurity event, but to be able to feel confident and to be able to move into the next phase, which is obviously the respond, function. But I think all of us, the visibility, and that's why I showed that picture again, because cyber visibility is so difficult. It's challenging, right? There's a lot of different types of instrumentation that we can use, and I'll share with you, some of that. But, some of the things that are so important that NIST points out is understanding things like suspicious traffic patterns on our network. Even if we don't necessarily decrypt all the traffic, Just understanding what systems are communicating with what, say on a normal day, how much traffic is occurring between these systems. That's one way to get visibility, right? And we'll highlight that a little bit. Secondly, this idea that there's malware hiding in disguise, we have to be able to do a better job to find that, and if we start to act up, to be able to know where it is and trace it through our organization. We have all kinds of things like botnets. You probably saw that in the news recently, where there was a big Internet of Things compromise on different systems, and now they're commanding all these botnets to launch, say, denial of service attacks against things, right? So we have to be able to discover what's called C2, or command and control type activity, and I'll share with you, a little bit more about that. So I could go through each one of these in turn, right? Encrypted traffic makes it challenging, it blinds technologies. We have all kinds of vulnerabilities out there that are difficult to manage, right? We have all kinds of software that's out there. It's very hard to stay on top of all the patches. Technologies don't all necessarily update themselves as easily as an iPhone, right? So we have to be able to know and have that visibility into what are some of the most important, vulnerabilities so that we can take the right action. Increasingly, we're seeing a lot of web attack vectors too. We heard concepts like malvertising, for example. A legitimate website can actually have a illegitimate or potentially malicious advertisement on it. It's not actually hosted by that site. The typical, web page now makes several connections behind the scenes. So some hackers are getting wise to this idea that you could take a legitimate website, put an advertisement out there that's actually malicious, right? So I think some stuff like that is, it's sort of changing the game, right? It's not just static HTML like, 20 years ago. Like I mentioned, this idea of effectively detecting, right, requires this strategy that I'll propose, right, which is called this integrated threat defense strategy, right? It's a conceptual level approach that I think that if all of us, take and use in our organizations, I think, and also not to mention this too, but also to demand of vendors, right, like me for Cisco, is to demand an integrated threat defense strategy so that these solutions can work together and solve the challenges and make it easier for all of us to defend, right, and detect. And of course, it requires all of these people, process, and technology controls, and it requires the coordination, among the three. There's no shortage of, let me put it this way. There's a very big shortage of cybersecurity professionals that are out there. And even if we could throw as many people at the problem as we can, I think all of us realize that today's threats happen so fast, right, that people alone, can't solve the problem. So it's so important for us to interlink the people, process, and technology controls for effective detection. I stand up here and I kind of laugh though, because in reality, these things are kind of easier said than done, right? So like I said, a combination of things like taking the integrated threat defense strategy that I'll propose and take us through in just a couple of minutes here, but also consider taking advantage of best practices like the NIST cybersecurity framework to help, break it down and make it into a manageable piece. When I think about effective detection, I think of, the foundation of truly effective cybersecurity has to be rooted in certain pillars, right? First of all, simplicity. I kind of joke about that in cybersecurity because nothing's really ever simple. But the more that we, for example, from the vendor community can do a better job of making things simple. So for example, wouldn't it be great if the cybersecurity technology was able to automatically detect an anomaly, right? And feed back into an automated access control piece, right? To be able to potentially chop off an anomaly, right? Or what if the user interface, right? What if it was able to say, hey, based upon the traffic that I'm seeing, why don't you put these rules in place based on the network the traffic that we're seeing? We think that those will be the most effective, right? What if the user interface was extremely intuitive, that actually mapped out where the malware happened in your organization and showed you what specific systems were affected and which ones, right? The path by which, those things were affected. I think that's what I mean in terms of making things simpler, right? We have to be able to do a better job with our people, but we can't overburden them with millions of different user interfaces and complexity. So a second aspect of this is, openness. And what we mean by that is, first of all, leveraging things like open application programming interfaces. These things have to be able to integrate, and you're never going to have a single, vendor environment. And even if you did, all those technologies may not necessarily, integrate. So leveraging things like open standards, open APIs, and so forth is a key aspect of, effective security. And the third part is I think it's a bit of a challenge for a lot of us in cybersecurity. We don't want the machines to take over, right? Security operations center, configuration management teams, right? They don't want to, first of all, relinquish control, but they also realize that sometimes when the machines start making decisions, they can make the wrong one and affect operations. But in today's world, we have to strike the right balance between automation, right, and human intelligence. And I think that's what we're putting out there in terms of automation, right? It's not 100% one way or the other, but we have to do a better job of trusting the technology so that we can respond more effectively. Recently, the Department of Homeland Security put out an RFI for what was called the Enterprise Automated Security Environment, right? It's trying to get to this point where we can do a far better job, right, of integrating technology to be able to respond more effectively. So this is where, I guess I wanted to share with you the 6 tenets that I propose, right, of an integrated threat defense strategy. It's actually pretty simple. We talked about some of these, right? I have 6 of them on the screen here. I won't go through them in gory detail. Certainly, like I said, the slides will be available. But I think the first thing we point out is that we have to be able to, the mindset here requires a richer network and security architecture. So what do we mean by that? Well, networks of the past, right? They were, routing traffic and so forth, but they weren't necessarily, they didn't necessarily have security built into them, right? So for example, think of, the domain name system. You go and ask DNS for www.cnn.com and you get an IP address back. And you go and click and off you go. But what if it's CNN with an extra N and that's a malicious site, right? DNS isn't smart enough on its own to say, hey, that's malicious, right? It just responds like a Unix system. You tell it what to do and it does it, right? But imagine today if things like DNS had security built into it to help, protect us from these kinds of things. And that's what I mean by having more of a richer network and security architecture, is to build security into the technologies that, that all of us use and rely on, right, to do business every day, but also to use that security to be able to be part of that integrated threat defense strategy. A second aspect, again, is this idea of that, we tend to want to put, best in class. How many of us look at the, we were going to evaluate some, security product and we look to the Gartner Magic Quadrant and we evaluate the 3 vendors in the leaders quadrant, and right, and that's kind of what guides our decision making, right? Maybe it's not 100% of it, but I think you get the idea that trying to put best in class technology isn't necessarily always the right answer. Right? In a lot of ways, what we're doing is we're creating a more fragmented environment around. But not only that, a lot of times when we put technologies in place, we're not deploying them to their full capabilities. Right? A number of customers that I've seen use various, for example, like I'm sure you're familiar with security information and event management, types of technologies that have been, prevalent over the past, 10 years or so. So many of them use 8, 9, 10% of their capabilities. Right? So they buy this best-in-class technology, but it's so complicated, right, to get the value out of it. And a third point that we point out here is this idea of, having visibility into encrypted traffic without necessarily having to crack the code, right? We can get so much insight into malicious activity and so forth by just monitoring our traffic, right, whether it's encrypted or not. The fourth point I mentioned from that, the previous effective security slide is leveraging open APIs. We have to be able to integrate the technologies, right? And vendors like Cisco, for example, we have a commitment to opening APIs and building on an ecosystem of various different vendor solutions to make sure that they can all work together. The fifth aspect is that we can't keep throwing more gear at it. So one of the things that's important, right, and the demand of security vendors is to build more capabilities into what's already out there. So for example, what if our firewall also is able to scan for malware? Right? I don't want to buy a separate box for malware, right? Maybe from a performance perspective, maybe I get forced into that kind of situation. But the point that I'm trying to say is that the more we can do a better job of integrating these technologies and making more solutions, right? Solve the problem more completely. Let's just not keep throwing more gear, right, to install. And then finally, the idea is that I mentioned previously about, automating and coordination. So this integrated threat defense, these 6 tenets are sort of more of a mindset, like an approach to security, right? And how to think about putting together the architecture, right? Leveraging things like the NIST cybersecurity framework to be able to detect and respond, more effectively. So I covered all of that on this slide, in part because I have a much longer presentation where I kind of go through each one of these in turn. So we don't have a ton of time here. I think I might have maybe 10 minutes left. I certainly want to leave a couple minutes for questions. But I mentioned things like the richer network and security architecture is about building that security into the network itself and leveraging those capabilities. Secondly, we talked about, not just more than just technology, right? We can't keep throwing technology at the problem. Right, so I think the other aspect of that is that it does emphasize the importance of having good people and process, controls as well. The third aspect is that visibility into encrypted malicious traffic. I presented about 2 weeks ago on this, and someone asked me, well, How important is it for my organization to try to decrypt SSL traffic? 90% of the traffic on our network is SSL. I think that's a risk-based decision that every organization needs to make. Right? I think all of us have to analyze the costs and try to understand the benefits. But I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that we can do a lot in terms of effective threat detection without actually trying to decrypt all this stuff. But if we were able to analyze the DNS requests, if we were able to analyze network traffic patterns, if we understood what was normal and what was different, what was not normal, right, I think that could go a long way. The fourth aspect is that leveraging open APIs. And again, this idea that multi-vendor environments, we're here to stay, right? No vendor, not even Cisco, with we have a comprehensive cyber portfolio. No one's going to say, hey, we need to go with a single vendor solution. It's the only way things are going to integrate, right? So we at Cisco, it's just one vendor as an example, that we're committed to making sure that these technologies can integrate and share threat information, right? So that the automation can actually take place. Again, I think I mentioned, requiring less gear. I think that sort of makes a lot of sense to most of us. Plus, we don't have the budget for every single thing, right? You might do a risk analysis with the cybersecurity framework and realize, oh gosh, now I need to buy, all this stuff, but we don't have the funds, for something like that. One of the great things about the framework, by the way, is a lot of organizations use it to actually educate above in their organization, right, at the board level and things, to make the appropriate investment decisions, right? They'll use the framework and say, hey, we've conducted a risk assessment. These are the top 3 areas where we see risk, and this is the reason for our funding request. So just wanted to point that out as well. And then the 6th one is all about that idea of really trusting automation. We've tried this, right? 10 years ago, we had concepts like the self-defending networks and things like that, right? But so many of us are just so resistant to let the automation occur, and we get it, right? But at the same time, we have to be able to use automation. I think self-driving cars are coming, right? They're not here today for a lot of reasons. Obviously the technology has a way to go, but the automation is coming, and we have to be able to use it, right, and leverage and benefit, from the automation. The one last thing I thought I would do is just take these tenets and apply them back to the threat detection scenario. So, for example, remember that first scenario where we have this, a big pile of data that's leaving a database server? So one of the ways we can do it without going through all of this detail is, like I mentioned, the network itself actually generates information about traffic patterns, right? It can say that on a normal day, this database server is only connecting to these 5 systems, and all of a sudden, there's a whole pile of information that's going in a new direction, right? So the integrated threat defense strategy would not only detect that anomaly, right, but it could also feed that signal back to an access policy that says, hey, why don't we cut that traffic off the network itself, right? And we're not talking necessarily a firewall rule update, which could work, in this case, and is one way to do it. But also the network itself could actually cut that traffic off, right? So that way we can limit the damage, right? We see this anomaly, the automation takes place, it stops a whole, bunch of sensitive information from leaving the organization, and that gives people time to get, stop the damage, and now we can respond and recover more effectively. When we look at things like, evasive malicious code, right? Maybe that code has been, brought into the organization, right? So one of the ways that we can do it is, put effective malware detection at different spots, right, throughout the network. Maybe it's just at the ingress and egress, right? Maybe it's through the firewall technology and integrate that into the capabilities. What if it's, a lot of us with mobile devices? What if the malware protection was built into the VPN client as well, right? For example, right? I think you get the idea, which is leveraging that type of, that tenet of taking more capability, but putting into existing technologies. The third point I mentioned is about, botnet command and control, like even knowing that it's happening. So much of that stuff just happens with, regular DNS type connections, and some of it through, SSH connections. So if we actually monitor that type of traffic, we could, sort of chop that off at the knees, right? We could spot potentially botnet. We can know what sources, right, are out there that are known, command and control type servers, and mitigate, that type of traffic. So again, we could spend, I wish I did, have more time to go a little more deeper into all those. I guess the last one I wanted to mention too is that, the ransomware type of solution, right, where, by this point, when your files are already already locked up, right, a lot of times it's too late. So without making it a Cisco commercial, as part of our integrated threat defense strategy, we pulled together a number of key preventative, detective, and compensating types of controls to help, with ransomware defense, right, to be able to, prevent it from happening in the first place, but also be able to respond, the minute that it does. One aspect too about the NIST cybersecurity framework is that in the protect function, they actually go through the highlights of, doing proper backup and restore and testing the procedures. So again, then the cybersecurity framework gives us a lot of capability around how to protect against things like malware and to be able to respond in case that occurs. And that kind of brings me to this point, right? We take this integrated threat defense approach and aligning it with this cybersecurity framework, like I mentioned, it organizes the functions across these 5 core areas. But when we look at just the detect function and just specifically what NIST says to do, they say in the framework to do these 3 things at a high level, right? There's obviously a lot of categories underneath. But one of the first things they say in terms of effective detection is look for anomalies and events, right? Like we've talked about all throughout this presentation, understanding anomalies and knowing what's normal and what isn't, in a lot of ways that can help us, right? So they point out that being able to detect that in a timely basis is so important. Another aspect is what's called security continuous monitoring. This is actually a pretty big topic. NIST devoted a whole separate publication. I think it's NIST 800-137, if I remember correctly, for information security continuous monitoring. But this is this idea that we can't just, point in time, check, our controls. We have to constantly, continuously monitor, right? We can't just, audit once and, 6 months later, we're fine. This idea is to be able to use, continuous monitoring types of controls to give us that situational awareness that we need. And then finally, this detection processes really highlights the people and process. So it's not just about, having potentially a run book for people to follow or knowing, where to go, but how do you communicate the fact that we've detected something, right? How do we improve our detection processes and so forth, right? So it gets into a lot of those people and process controls to really help us detect effectively. And I think you could probably see that, throughout the course of our conversation here, that this integrated threat defense strategy really supports, the best practices, not only from the NIST cybersecurity framework, but really, any best practice that you might follow. Some of you might follow the ISO 27000 series, the, SANS top 20 critical security controls, you name it. But I think you'll find that this integrated threat defense approach really does support, right? And it's a great mindset to have when approaching effective detection. So in the last couple of minutes here, I think I only have about 4 or less. We have to be able to reduce that time to detection. So like I mentioned, all the slides will be shared. I hope you'll consider taking this type of approach in your organization. To learn more, again, the links will be provided. The Cisco Talos Research Organization, all that research is free, right? talosintelligence.com. I mentioned NIST best practices. The framework itself is nist.gov/cyber framework, but if you're not already familiar with the Computer Security Resource Center, right, just go to csrc.nist.gov. It gives links to all of their best practices across computer security. Name a topic, right, and they probably have a publication, on it. We at Cisco, we're one of the sponsors here. I appreciate you listening to us and mention a little bit about our capabilities. We hope to talk with you a little more about it. And I think I mentioned the security reports, the annual and mid-year security reports. Now, integrated threat defense, well, I thought it'd end on integrated treat defense, which is obviously impossible. So thought I'd end on that and see what questions we had. And if there are none, that's okay, but we're around. We'd love to hear. If you have your hand up over here, I probably can't see you. Yeah, so the question was, can we make the slides available? And in fact, SAINTCON is going to make all these slides available. So they already have a complete copy of the decks here, so they'll let you know when they're available. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time.